Welcome to Trending Unpacked, the show where we explore the stories behind the trends shaping our world. We've gathered, well, quite a stack of sources today. Meteorological reports, policy papers, and just that relentless stream of social media you see with big events like this.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out what Hurricane Melissa really signifies.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just another big storm. It feels like a modern phenomenon, doesn't it? For those of us tracking it, the core issue became pretty clear pretty fast.
What was that?
It was when Melissa slowed down. That's when the danger just ramped up exponentially. Because these storms, they aren't just about wind speed anymore. They're about time and place.
Exactly. Time and place. And Hurricane Melissa is already, well, it's trending everywhere globally.
Yeah.
One of the strongest Atlantic storms people can remember, certainly recently. It's dominating news cycles. It's all over your social feeds. We've all seen those dramatic satellite loops.
Mesmerizing in a terrifying way.
Totally. But for you listening, our mission today is really to cut through that spectacle. We want to understand the maybe terrifying truth behind it. What makes this storm so different? And what does its behavior, its personality almost, tell us about where global weather might be heading?
It's a fascinating question. The storm, I think, really forces a kind of confrontation. It pits our, highly specialized, maybe even brittle global infrastructure against this rapidly changing climate reality.
A confrontation, that's a strong word.
Well, we're looking at a new kind of threat profile operationally. It's one defined by nature's ability to just sustain catastrophic pressure, not for hours, but for days on end.
That's sustained pressure. That feels like the absolute key here. Okay, let's unpack the raw facts then. Let's start with the sheer, kind of uncompromising power of Melissa itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so our sources all confirm Melissa peaked as a major Category 5 Atlantic hurricane. This is the top of the scale, right?
That's correct. Category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, highest classification you can get. And this maximum intensity hit in late October 2025. So, yeah, its wind speeds alone put it straight into the catastrophic zone.
But the classification, as you said, is just the end result. The story of its power is in how it got there, its origin story.
Exactly. It started, pretty innocently, as these things often do. A typical tropical wave off West Africa around October 16th, standard stuff. What really shocked meteorologists, and you see this highlighted across all your reports, wasn't that it grew, it was the speed, the rate at which it just matured.
Yeah, the sources keep mentioning this frightening period of rapid intensification. Once that wave hit the Caribbean Sea, it wasn't a gradual build, it just exploded.
Exploded is the right word, a meteorological bomb, basically.
But what ingredients were there? What allowed it to, slam the accelerator down so hard?
Well, you had this perfect storm of factors, literally. First, and this is crucial, you had these unprecedented sea surface temperatures, SSTs. They were several degrees above average for late October, which is already warm water season. So the upper layers of the ocean were just saturated with energy. That's the fuel. Gallons and gallons of high-octane fuel.
Okay, so massive fuel supply. What else?
Secondly, the conditions above the storm were, well, perfect. You had very, very low vertical wind shear.
Okay, low vertical wind shear. For the listener, what does that mean in practical terms? Why is that important?
Right, so think of the hurricane like a spinning top, a really powerful one. Wind shear, that's basically different wind speeds or directions at different heights in the atmosphere. It's like someone constantly bumping the table the top is spinning on.
Okay, it disrupts it.
Precisely. It tilts the storm, messes up its internal structure, stops it from getting properly organized and strong. Low vertical shear means the atmosphere was incredibly calm and uniform vertically. It allowed the storm's powerful inner core, the eye wall, to stack up perfectly straight, like a perfect chimney.
Okay.
This maximizes the efficiency of the storm's engine, transferring heat from the ocean into wind speed. So you combine that massive warm fuel supply below with this perfect structure above, and boom. That's how you get that shocking immediate jump. It basically skipped the lower categories, jumping straight to Cat 4, then Cat 5.
Wow, that speed, that rapid intensification,
Yeah.
it feels like a really modern signature, something we're seeing more of.
It is. It's a hallmark of storms fueled by exceptionally warm waters.
Okay, but let's talk about the point of impact, where it hit hardest.
Right. So Melissa made landfall in Jamaica, near New Hope Parish, and the force was just devastating. Sustained winds were clocked around 185 miles per hour. That's about 295 kilometers per hour.
185 mile per hour is sustained. In Category 5 starts at 157 miles per hour, right?
Correct. So it wasn't just barely a Cat 5. It was deep into the extreme end of that category. A monster.
That detail is critical, and it ties records, I believe, for Atlantic landfalls. Just raw, brute power.
It does. It puts it in very rare company.
But as you mentioned right at the start, if this had just been a fast-moving storm hitting with that power, the damage would have been horrific. Historically bad, sure.
Yeah.
but different.
Completely different profile. And that's the real kicker here. The thing that defines Melissa's uh, destructive legacy, the slow drift factor. Once it got into the Caribbean and started interacting with some other atmospheric features, it basically stalled. It became near stationary at times, just sitting there.
So time became the weapon.
Exactly. Time multiplied the impact enormously.
Can you explain that a bit more? How did that slow movement turn what was already a catastrophic wind event into this sustained flooding and surge catastrophe across Jamaica?
Sure. So a fast-moving Cat 5, even a powerful one, might pass over a specific town or area in, say, 6 to 8 hours. Intense, terrifying, destructive, yes, but finite. During that time, you get the peak wind damage, sure, but the rainfall, while heavy, is spread out as the storm moves on.
Right.
Melissa, though, it just sat there, stalled. When a storm of that immense size and intensity sits over the same piece of land for 24 hours, 36 hours, maybe even 48 hours, you're exposed to its ferocious wind field for that entire time, yes. But crucially, you're also exposed to its entire moisture field, continuously, nonstop.
So the water hazards just compound.
And compound.
Exponentially. It becomes this marathon of misery, not a sprint.
A marathon of misery, that's a good way to put it. A hydrological siege. And your sources, they highlight some truly terrifying specific threats that come directly from this. We're talking catastrophic rainfall, potential totals reaching 30 to 40 inches.
40 inches. I can't even picture that.
It's an almost impossible volume of water. To give you some context, for many places, that's 3, 4, even 5 months of average rainfall, delivered in 2 or 3 days.
And when you dump that much water onto a place like Jamaica, mountainous, often steep terrain,
the results are immediate and devastating. That prolonged extreme rainfall just completely saturates the soil. It overwhelms every natural stream, every engineered drain, everything. This inevitably leads to, first, devastating flash flooding in low-lying areas. But perhaps even more lethally, it triggers large-scale landslides on the slopes. The saturated earth itself just gives way.
oh wow.
And there's more. That slow, churning motion of the storm sitting offshore allows it to physically push ocean water towards the coast for a really extended period. This sustains a critical storm surge. Reports indicated it reached about 13 feet in some areas.
13 feet of storm surge on top of the rain.
Yeah, so try to picture it for a moment. You've got 185-mile-per-hour winds trying to tear your building apart. At the same time, 13 feet of salt water is inundating the lower levels. And simultaneously, the very ground beneath you might be actively collapsing or sliding away because it's so saturated.
Yeah, an almost insurmountable combination of hazards.
Yeah.
You can see why the infrastructure toll was so immediate.
Absolutely. The documented impact on centralized systems across the island was profound and immediate. The power grid failure was massive. It impacted over 500,000 people.
500,000 people without power.
And that's not just, the lights being off. That's 500,000 people, potentially, without power for pumps providing clean water, without refrigeration for essential medicines, without the basic ability to communicate, to call for help, to get news.
And this highlights that vulnerability of centralized infrastructure, doesn't it? Power stations, water pumping facilities, communication towers, often designed for efficiency, maybe clustered together.
Exactly. That centralization becomes a massive point of vulnerability when it's subjected to this kind of sustained assault over days. It creates a domino effect.
How so?
Well, if the main power station fails, maybe the entire water treatment and pumping system for a large area just halts. Hospitals, they might have backup generators, sure, but those rely on finite fuel reserves. After 48, 72 hours of continuous operation, those run dry, and suddenly your major regional hospital isn't an asset, it's a liability. This sustained pressure test, it basically revealed that many systems were likely built assuming historical hurricane speeds. Endure the punch, then start repairs. They weren't designed for this new siege dynamic.
Right, a siege, not a punch. And we know the storm didn't just stop after Jamaica. It continued its slow, ominous crawl. What about the regional preparedness? Did other places see this coming?
They did. Governments across the region seemed to take that slow drift threat very seriously. As the forecast path started pointing towards eastern Cuba, then the Bahamas, with even potential long-range implications for Bermuda, you saw large-scale preemptive evacuations being mandated. The reports mention roughly 281,000 people evacuated in eastern Cuba alone.
Wow, nearly 300,000.
Yeah, and that number tells you something. It demonstrates a clear understanding by the regional authorities that the primary threat here wasn't just the wind. It was the prolonged water the surge, and especially that biblical rainfall. They focused on moving populations out of those floodplains and landslide-prone zones.
So the meteorological story is clear. A monster Cat 5 that learned how to stall, multiplying its destructive power through water and time.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now. Let's move from the hard facts of the storm to how the modern world, experienced it, processed it, talked about it, the sustained spectacle, hashtag tag 3, internet theories and cultural interpretations. So Hurricane Melissa didn't just hit the Caribbean hard. It became this global spectacle almost instantly. Your sources point out that the term Hurricane Melissa just surged everywhere. Global news, social media. It turned this catastrophic regional event into something the whole world was watching, almost collectively.
It's a perfect modern case study in that sense. I think the story resonates so strongly globally because it perfectly combines two things. First, you have the traditional high drama of a massive Category 5 hurricane, which we've always tracked intensely. Those satellite images are just inherently compelling.
But then it merges that with this very visual, easily digestible evidence of what climate change looks like in action. Specifically, storms that seem to intensify faster and move slower. It just fits the narrative of an escalating climate crisis so neatly, which makes it incredibly shareable online.
And once something like this hits social media, the sheer volume of documentation, the way people share it, it takes on a life of its own, doesn't it? It stops being just a weather report from afar. It becomes this shared, real-time tragedy unfolding, even for someone thousands of miles away, just tracking it on their phone app.
Exactly. That media amplification mechanism is just relentless now. You have the real-time tracking data, satellite loops, forecast cones, coupled with the immediacy of photos and videos coming from the ground via social media. It transforms the event into this kind of global spectacle where maybe the line between consuming news and a sort of morbid disaster tourism starts to blur.
Disaster tourism. That's an interesting, if unsettling, thought.
Well, the visibility of people's survival attempts, and sadly the devastation, becomes almost universal, instantaneous.
And that visibility, it led to some really profoundly contradictory stuff on social media, didn't it?
Yeah.
Your sources picked up on this. On one hand, you had very serious documentation. People using hashtags like hashtag Caribbean Storm of the Century, really emphasizing the terrifying severity, the historical nature of the wind and rain.
Right. The gravity was certainly there, but then almost alongside it, you saw the emergence of this truly dissonant, almost weird content. The chatter included things like hashtag Melissa Fail and the strange intersection of extreme danger and, well, mundane documentation, especially among tourists, it seems, who couldn't get out in time.
Okay, hashtag Melissa Fail.
Yeah.
What was that about? Was it just like dark humor or something else going on there?
It seems like a mix of things. Maybe a strange coping mechanism, definitely some digital irony. Hashtag Melissa Fail often seem to accompany pictures of like relatively minor inconveniences happening amidst total chaos.
Yeah.
A slightly flooded hotel balcony, maybe a canceled flight notification screenshot, someone trying to make coffee during a power outage and failing. It felt like this digital attempt to kind of shrink the scale of the threat. Maybe mock its power in a way, or perhaps just create content that felt less terrifying than the actual reality unfolding just outside the window. A way to feel some control, maybe.
Interesting. And the documentation culture itself was striking, too. The reports mentioned things like last chance selfies before hunkering down, or images of flooded resort lobbies being shared widely.
Yeah, it really illustrates that profound contradiction of our digital age, doesn't it? We seem compelled to document the end of normalcy using the very tools of normal life. You have people genuinely facing potentially life-threatening conditions, tourists stranded, residents sheltering in damaged homes, and yet there's this simultaneous impulse to generate consumable, shareable content about that very threat.
It's a real tension between the community responses, the evacuations, the seriousness of it, and this sort of stay safe but keep posting, keep documenting impulse. Almost like trying to maintain normalcy online when it's collapsed offline.
The stay safe but still normal life. Contradiction. Exactly. People are forced to evacuate or shelter. Their lives are completely upended. Yet that cultural impulse to observe, record, and share remains incredibly active, even in moments that must feel pretty existential.
And all this cultural output, this constant digital echo of the storm, it ironically feeds right back into the bigger picture, providing more anecdotal evidence for the structural theories around Melissa, specifically the climate crisis connection.
Absolutely. It fuels that interpretation.
This is where researchers and policy analysts really jumped on Melissa, wasn't it? Citing it as a definitive wake-up call.
Yeah.
We talked about the warmer oceans, but what specific scientific mechanisms in Melissa's behavior really provide those definitive proof points for the climate change link?
Well, the storm's whole life cycle, its trajectory, its intensity profile, it lined up almost perfectly with what climate models have been predicting for years. We already covered the unprecedented sea surface temperatures, the fuel source, but researchers also emphasized the high ocean heat content, or OHC.
OHC. What's that?
It means the warmth wasn't just a thin layer on the surface. It extended deep down into the water column, maybe 100, 150 meters deep. This deep reservoir of warm water provides a virtually inexhaustible fuel source for the storm. It prevents the storm from doing something called upwelling.
Upwelling.
That's when a strong storm churns up deeper, colder water, which can then act like a brake, cooling the surface and weakening the storm. It's a natural self-limiting process. With such deep warmth, Melissa basically couldn't churn up cold water. It just kept drawing on that deep heat, preventing self-limiting.
So it had these deep, almost endless reserves of energy, far beyond a typical hurricane.
Pretty much. But then you combine that supercharged fuel source with the slow drift, and scientists are increasingly linking that slow movement directly to weakened atmospheric steering currents.
Ah, the steering currents.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about changes in the large-scale general circulation patterns of the atmosphere, perhaps involving a weakening or maybe a shift in the position of the big high-pressure systems, like the subtropical ridge, often called the Bermuda High in the Atlantic. These big systems normally act like guides, pushing storms westward or turning them northward. When these steering currents become sluggish, weaker, well, the storm doesn't get pushed along effectively, it just sits there and spins.
So, okay, let me see if I've got this. You have a storm that's rapidly superfueled by deep ocean energy.
Right.
And then it's basically held in place or allowed to meander very slowly by these weak, maybe lazy atmospheric steering currents.
That's the combination. It's the optimal scenario for disaster multiplication. Maximum fuel, minimum movement.
That synthesis feels crucial. Melissa really exemplifies how these broader climate shifts aren't just making storms potentially stronger, but also inherently slower, longer lasting, which fundamentally changes the threat.
Absolutely. The threat profile shifts from being primarily about a powerful, quick punch to being about a sustained multi-day siege.
And that distinction, that idea of a siege versus a punch, brings us right to the psychological impact. You mentioned it earlier, a storm defined by lingering rather than a quick, violent flash.
Yeah.
How does that feel different to people experiencing it? How does the emotional trauma differ?
Oh, it hits the human psyche completely differently. I mean, think about it this way. A quick, violent storm, even a very destructive one, it's like an acute trauma, maybe like breaking a bone. It's immediate. It's terrifying, yes. But then it's over. The event itself is finite.
Okay.
Melissa, because it lingered, because it was slow, it was more like having a heavy, immovable weight placed slowly on your chest and left there for 48 hours or more. It forced entire populations to just suspend normal life, suspend routine for days on end, all while knowing that the pressure, the rain, the wind, the threat, it wasn't going to let up anytime soon.
So the dread isn't just about that initial terrifying wind gust. It's the slow, grinding, non-abstract threat of the rain continuing, hour after hour after hour, the power staying out, the floodwaters rising inch by inch, day after day.
Exactly. For many people caught in it, understanding Melissa is probably less about the 185-mile-per-hour wind statistic and more about that gut-level emotional reality of sustained vulnerability, that feeling of being trapped, of knowing the environment outside is actively hostile and the pressure just will not yield. It transforms the experience. It's not just an external weather event anymore. It becomes this deep internal dread, and that affects mental health long, long after the floodwaters finally recede.
And that psychological vulnerability, that sense of being under siege, it's almost perfectly mirrored in the vulnerability of our modern structures, isn't it? These slow-moving storms seem uniquely capable of showcasing how modern elements we rely on, think centralized tourism hubs, intricate just-in-time supply chains, sophisticated power grids, how uniquely vulnerable they are to sustained extreme weather.
That's a really important point. Our systems, by and large, seem built for resilience against a flash trauma. A high wind event that lasts, say, 12 hours, you ride it out, you repair. They are generally not built for a siege where critical infrastructure has to maintain functionality for days, maybe weeks, without any possibility of external resupply or repair crews getting in. The longer the event drags on, the more those fundamental modern services, banking, communications, water treatment, food distribution, just grind to a halt. It exposes the fragility beneath the surface. #tag4, analysis and takeaway.
Okay, let's try and bring these different threads together then. We've got the meteorological data, the Cat 5 power, the crucial slow drift. We've got the cultural response, the global spectacle, the memes, the documentation, and we've got the psychological impact, the siege mentality. What does this storm, Hurricane Melissa, ultimately reveal about our global resilience? Or maybe our lack of it?
I think we have to zoom right in on that specific vulnerability of centralized infrastructure, especially in island nations, but relevant elsewhere too. Places like Jamaica often rely, for reasons of cost and efficiency historically, on highly centralized systems. Power generation is often concentrated in one or two large plants, maybe near the coast. Tourism hubs, the absolute economic lifeblood for many islands, are by definition coastal and concentrated. Essential services, like water treatment or desalination plants, might be singular, large facilities.
Right. Makes sense from an engineering or economic standpoint, maybe?
Perhaps. But when Melissa delivered that sustained pressure, that multi-day assault, the whole system proved incredibly brittle. It collapsed quickly. Those power outages affecting over 500,000 people, they weren't just a fluke. They were, I think, stark evidence that infrastructure centrality, while maybe efficient in normal times, becomes a massive vulnerability multiplier when you're under a climate siege.
And that infrastructure failure, it directly magnifies existing inequality, doesn't it? Which brings us to something your analytical sources highlighted, this idea of the resilience paradox.
Yes, the resilience paradox. It's a really crucial concept for understanding the aftermath.
Can you define that paradox for us? Why does the ability to warn people seem to contrast so sharply with the ability or inability to recover afterwards?
Okay, so the paradox is basically this. On one hand, many island nations, including Jamaica, have developed remarkably sophisticated and effective early warning systems and evacuation procedures. They can successfully track the storm, issue warnings, and physically move hundreds of thousands of people out of the most immediate danger zones, like coastal surge areas or known landslide risks. That demonstrates incredible logistical resilience, right? That's the warning part, and it often works quite well.
Okay, so they're good at getting people out of the way beforehand.
Generally, yes. But then comes the recovery. And that's where the paradox kicks in. The recovery component is often deeply broken, slow, and inequitable.
Why? Why the big disparity between warning and recovery?
Because full, equitable recovery for these nations is incredibly difficult. These disasters don't happen in a vacuum. They slam into places with existing structural disadvantages, and they amplify them massively. Just consider two hypothetical entities in Jamaica after Melissa. On one side, you have a large, internationally owned, probably well-insured resort complex on the coast.
Okay.
On the other side, you have a smallholder farmer living in a remote inland parish. The resort likely benefits from prioritized infrastructure repair roads cleared, maybe power restored faster because it's an economic engine. It has international insurance, access to immediate capital from its parent company for rebuilding. The farmer, meanwhile, might have lost their home, their entire season's crop wiped out by 40 inches of rain or subsequent landslides. They're often uninsured, maybe already carrying debt. They become reliant on government or international aid, which notoriously arrives slowly, often with conditions attached, and might not cover the full extent of their loss.
Ah, I see. So the people who likely benefited least from the centralized economic model that the resort represents
Exactly.
are the very ones who faced the longest, hardest recovery timeline and are left most vulnerable when that centralized infrastructure fails them.
Precisely. Natural disasters like Melissa act as brutal amplifiers of social and economic inequality. They can lead to capital flight, long-term displacement of populations, and years, even decades, of economic hardship for the most vulnerable citizens. The immediate storm event might be over in a few days, but the structural consequences, the fallout from this paradox, that's just beginning to bite.
Which makes Melissa much more than just a freak weather event. It makes it a really painful microcosm of these larger global climate shifts and their unequal impacts. We have to connect Melissa's specific behavior, that Cat 5 strength, that unprecedented slow drift, back to the overall global trend that scientists are warning us about.
And the overall trend, which this storm provides really definitive real-world evidence for, is becoming clearer. Potentially fewer storms overall in some basins, but the ones that do form have a higher chance of becoming major hurricanes. And crucially, they are showing a statistically significant tendency to move more slowly. Slower movement leads to disproportionately more damage, especially water damage. So the traditional risk equation for hurricanes, which for decades focused almost exclusively on peak wind speed, well, it's becoming obsolete.
So the whole way we calculate risk, the very definition of the threat, is changing fundamentally. It's not just about wind anymore.
That really is the core synthesis, I think. This storm provides those definitive proof points for global policy discussions that are urgently needed. The primary threat now is becoming overwhelmingly time-based. It's focused on that sustained rainfall over days and the prolonged storm surge that results from slow movement. Just as much, or maybe even more, than peak wind speed. Think about it. You can't, with modern engineering and enough money, reinforce a building to withstand 185-mile-per-hour winds for a few hours. It is infinitely harder, maybe impossible, and certainly astronomically more expensive to reinforce an entire island, an entire community, against the sustained pressure of 40 inches of rain falling over 2 or 3 days and the widespread flooding and landslides that follow.
Which means we absolutely have to radically redefine what resilience means moving forward. If the storms are getting stronger, yes, but critically also moving slower. What does true resilience look like in the 21st century? It clearly has to go way beyond just better early warnings and a good evacuation culture.
It absolutely does. That's necessary, but nowhere near sufficient anymore. True resilience, going forward, seems to require integrating decentralized systems much more deeply into the national and even local blueprint.
Decentralized systems, like what?
Well, for energy, it means moving away from relying solely on 1 or 2 massive, vulnerable coastal power plants towards more local, distributed generation, maybe renewables like solar with battery storage, microgrids that can island themselves and keep power flowing locally even if the main grid goes down. It means seriously investing in locating critical infrastructure, hospitals, shelters, communication hubs away from the most vulnerable coastal areas or floodplains. And crucially, it means updating building codes and land use planning. Not just for maximum wind load, but designing for maximum sustained water load, for saturation, for landslide risk, and vulnerable topographies.
So the whole conversation needs to shift from can we temporarily survive the storm's peak to something more like how quickly and how equitably can our entire community, our entire nation, return to sustainable functioning operation after being under a sustained environmental siege that might last several days.
That's exactly the shift in thinking required. And that long view, that forward-looking perspective, it must explicitly incorporate the scientific reality of higher sea surface temperatures, higher ocean heat content, and increased storm severity into every single planning and rebuilding strategy from now on. We simply cannot afford to rebuild infrastructure back to 20th century standards and just cross our fingers hoping for 20th century climate patterns to return. Melissa made it brutally clear. That era is over. The sustained threat demands sustained, forward-looking, climate-adapted solutions.
It's a huge challenge. Building a hospital that can withstand a few hours of Cat 5 winds is one thing. Building a community that can sustain itself with power, water, communications, food for maybe a week without outside aid during a slow, continuous environmental assault.
Yeah.
That's a whole other level of challenge.
It is. But the policy discussions that are already emerging in the wake of Melissa, they are forcing exactly that conversation. People are talking seriously about decentralization, about insurance reform that properly accounts for climate vulnerability, about global aid mechanisms that need to be faster and maybe bypass slow government bureaucracy to get help directly to the most vulnerable, often uninsured populations on the ground. Melissa isn't just a case study anymore. It's become the definitive tragic example of why that shift needs to happen and why it needs to happen now. #5. Outro and teaser.
Well, Hurricane Melissa has certainly provided a chilling, very real-time look at the new dynamics of extreme weather in a changing climate. It showed us how quickly a meteorological event can spiral into, well, a profound cultural moment, a shared global experience, and ultimately a pretty stark structural indictment of the vulnerabilities in our centralized modern systems.
Yeah, Melissa really reminds us, doesn't it? Nature stops being this abstract concept pretty quickly when the wind actually hits your own door. And maybe more profoundly, when the rain doesn't stop for days. Well, that changes everything. The combination of that intense power and that almost glacial speed delivered a really tough lesson in climate vulnerability. A lesson I hope we don't ignore.
It's definitely an important synthesis of the data, the culture, the human impact. We hope this analysis of your sources gives you, the listener, the context you need to make sense of it all.
Thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Next time on Trending Unpacked, we're switching gears completely. From extreme weather to the uncanny. We're looking at jump scares. Why do our brains seem to almost love being startled? We'll be digging into the neuroscience and psychology behind that sudden jolt. Until then, keep questioning the trends around you.